All right, welcome everyone to another installment of Grid Down Consulting. I'm your host, as always, Jonathan Holler, and today we have a really good opportunity and truly blessed to have Dr. Peter Pry on with us today. And so if you are living under if you follow me and you're living under a rock and you know, because I post all of his articles, and he's, in my opinion, one of the greatest spokesmen on the grid down movement, and he's one of the few people that speaks truth to power, that doesn't curb the truth, and he's willing to say what needs to be said. If you have lived under a rock and don't know who he is, Dr. Peter Pry was formerly a intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy, operational plans, military doctrine, threat perceptions, and developing U.S. paradigms for strategic warning. He has been a fundamental part of the EMP Commission. He's been there since the beginning. He was instrumental in getting that started. He's on multiple congressional committees, Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, the Commission on New Strategic Posture of the United States, the EMP Commission. He's been all around Washington, D.C. So you, as my followers, hear me rant and say a lot, and I say a lot of things, but you're hearing it from the horse's mouth today. So one other thing I definitely want to point out is, if you haven't read it yet, in my top 5 book reviews, this was in there in the top 5, but he has a book out called The Power and the Light. You can find it on Amazon in paperback, in ebook format. And in my opinion, it is critical reading for anybody that's concerned about the vulnerability of the electric grid. He calls out the truth of what's happening behind the scenes. He names names, and I appreciate that, because so many people in the kind of the secure the grid fight want to take a softer stance, and they don't want to call anybody out by name. So I really appreciate him having the brevity and the honor of standing with truth and pushing for a harder grid. So without further ado, Dr. Peter Pry, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, John.
So as usual, with my core followers in the preparedness community, wanting to understand what's happening behind the scenes with the grid vulnerability. We saw what happened with Texas here recently. Discussed at length the solar winds and the cyber situation here last year. We have talked at length about the Russian attack on the Ukraine. But recently, one of the stories that I shared recently was China going after Mumbai's electric grid in retaliation for their border skirmish that they're having. I shared the New York Times article, and if you haven't seen it yet, we just posted Dr. Peter Pry's latest article called The Lessons of the China-India Blackout War. So let's go ahead and just start there. Dr. Pry, thanks for coming on, and if you could just kind of start out and just tell us what happened over there in India.
Sure. Well, ever since China swallowed Tibet in 1951, it has periodically tried to expand its borders in the Himalayas at India's expense. And recently, it tried to do that again. And but now India is a nuclear power, just like China. They're both nuclear-armed states, and both sides have been afraid to resort to the use of modern weapons in their combat in the high Himalayas, because they don't want it to escalate into a nuclear conflict. And so you have the curious situation of two technologically advanced nuclear weapon states using Stone Age tactics against each other in the high Himalayas, where the fighting is being done with shovels and clubs and fists, literally. And so China, to try to break the stalemate and get India to back off so that it could expand its borders at India's expense again in the high Himalayas, apparently blacked out Mumbai and sent a larger message to India that they could black out the whole Indian subcontinent, basically black out the India's as a nation, which would have catastrophic consequences for India, because the survival of their population, their economy, and their military too, all depends upon the electric grid. So India immediately regretted the fact that it had, well, a larger point to make before we move on is that should be, or I hope it might be, a crystallizing moment for military thinkers and strategists around the world. In the article, I call it a possible Monitor versus Merrimack moment. You know, when such as you had during the American Civil War, when the ironclads, the Monitor, the Northern historians called it the Merrimack. The actual name was the Virginia, on the southern side, their ironclad. When they had their famous shootout at Hampton Roads and couldn't sink each other, but they were able to destroy. The Virginia was able to destroy all the Union ships that that were there. It represented a watershed moment in naval history. Things would never be the same again. The thousands of years of the age of sail and wooden fighting ships basically came to an end, and all the navies of the world recognized that a revolution in military affairs had happened, and that this new kind of technology, the armored warship, was now going to change not only the course of naval warfare, but the course of world history. Because sea power is battleships back in those days were the ICBMs of their day, the fundamental coin of strategic power. And I'm hoping that this might be, even for our dullest people in Washington and elsewhere around the world, might get noticed and become our Monitor versus Merrimack, because this is a new way of warfare that has even more revolutionary implications, more revolutionary fundamental implications, because it means you might be able to fight and win a war just by blacking out the other guy's electric grids and render obsolete all the traditional elements of military power. If that is so, and if you can win a war just by doing that, it means that armies and navies and air forces can become as obsolete as wooden sailing ships, and a war could be won or lost almost at the speed of light, by blacking out through cyber, EMP attack, physical sabotage. So,
Yes.
hoping,
being down at the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force with you, which was headed up by General Quast, he had his main speaking point was that the future wars are going to be fought, won or lost in electromagnetic spectrum.
yes.
And who controls the electromagnetic spectrum is going to win the future wars. And it seems to me, and I'm not denigrating anybody in our, the leaders in our military today, they're still focused on building the biggest tanks and the fastest battleships and the fastest planes, and they're still focusing on physical warfare solely. Like that's their blinders are on, where we have this amazing military and military might that can be, if you take the ones and zeros out of the equation, that stuff don't matter anymore. It's like the Maginot Line, we're preparing for the battle of 2000, where we're not preparing for the battle for 2040 is, kind of what I see. And that's where all this stuff is heading. And, it wasn't just the Chinese, it was two countries I'd never heard of fought a war here, 6 months ago. And the one country had a small military and they won with drones, right? New warfare, new technology.
Yeah, it was the Nagorno-Karabakh War.
Yes.
Right. Armenia and Azerbaijan. It was Azerbaijan that prevailed. Right.
Yeah.
I wrote an article about that too, actually. Nobody else seemed to have noticed it.
Right.
Would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't written that article. And then that article did get people's attention. It's the first time in military history that an unmanned air force, has prevailed over another country that had a sophisticated manned air force and a significant army. And that's just another example of thing I point out, that it's always an uphill climb to get people to see the reality of the future. The way it usually works, I use a number of examples. For example, for example, in the Battle of the Somme in 1917, when the British Army, finally figures out that you just can't walk guys into trenches that are made by guys with machine guns, and
Right.
80,000 casualties in a couple of hours, or the panzer divisions that rolled over France in 1940 and over the Maginot Line that France thought was impregnable, you know, and us at Pearl Harbor, of course, where Japanese carrier aviation taught us that the battleship was not the future of warfare, it was the aircraft carrier. And one can go through many examples, but it always seems that in very few cases does the defending side, the side that ends up being under attack, have they the foresight to prepare for that future war. You know, the future comes upon us unexpectedly, and somebody has to get hammered somewhere, you know, for us to wake up. And
China and Russia are preparing for that future war. They're focusing on space. They're focusing on all this stuff. It seems like they're really taking seriously the futuristic warfare that's coming. And you know, maybe we are behind the scenes too. I imagine at some level we are, but I'm not super confident that.
The predator nations, you know, there are these nations. All nations are not the same. All strategic cultures are not the same. All through history, whether it was the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, which the Athenians lost to the Spartans, or the Punic Wars, the three Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, where Carthage went down to Rome, over and over again. You know, there are in history what I call predator nations. Well, you might call them national security states or military dictatorships, really is what they are for the most part. And their strategic culture and most of their creative energy is focused on warfare. It's not focused on living the good life and you know, producing Hollywood movies and having a material, raising the lives of your working people and middle class so people can have vacations and have the soft life. You know, those are, that's what free societies tend to be like, you know. But these states, their object is to first consolidate power within their totalitarian or authoritarian systems. And such systems, their psychology is that coexistence with anyone else is impossible, just like tolerating alternative political parties within your system is impossible. You know, they don't trust any alternative, just as they don't trust any dissenting political parties within their system, they don't trust other countries that they don't control, dominate, or conquer outside their system. So coexistence tends to be possible, and they're always focused on war. And the most creative thing they do has to do with warfare. And that's why you end up with, why the bad guys usually end up with surprising new technologies and tactics that work against the good guys, you know, and we are so often in trouble, even when it comes to relatively small totalitarian powers like North Korea during the outbreak of the Korean War, you know, and they surprised us with Russian T-34 tanks that were a lot better than the Shermans, and with infantry tactics that we hadn't anticipated, and came very close to winning the Korean War right from the outset, even though we were a nuclear weapons state, by the way, and they were so aggressive that they were willing to take us on, even though they had no nuclear weapons, and we did. Right. You know, a lesson we should keep in mind when we think about what the current North Korean regime might do now that they do have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I want to ask you about North Korea here in a minute, but let's step back to my reading of the China-India conflict and just my perception from, you know, 3,000 feet is that it was a shot across the bow. It was a warning, you know, and I think you would probably agree. I want to hear your thoughts in a minute here. Russia did the same thing to the Ukraine. So you've got these aggressive state actors that are firing warning shots across the bow saying, hey, this is our ability. And I think part of the issue is most people look at that, and like I saw the New York Times article, but it wasn't widely covered that China took down Mumbai's electric grid, or we suppose it's China. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, that's a futuristic warfare that's coming into place. In India, I think I read one of their generals commenting about, yeah, we've got a problem because all of our transformers that we bought came from China, right? Their technology in their grid all comes from China, and they're kind of almost acknowledging the fact that, this is a problem for the future of warfare, and it wasn't a major attack. And so I guess my point is as a country, as a nation, we just found out that 10% of the transformers in New York City actually came from China. That doesn't discount the other 90% that have Chinese SCADA and equipment and technology built into it that could have backdoors in it. So we have the same vulnerability that a lot of these other nations like India and Ukraine have. We have these same vulnerabilities. We know SolarWinds, we know Russia's in our grid, China's in our grid. We have these same vulnerabilities, but the average American doesn't know anything. And my fear is that with all these other things that you talked about, like futuristic warfare, and someone came out with something big that we weren't prepared for, and there was a lot of loss of casualty here and a lot of loss of casualty there. But this isn't something we come back from. We can't, run this risk of saying, we'll address it and we'll try and fix the problem after the first attack, because the first attack could be it. It could be done with, right? So I really see this, and I hope, it looks like there's some promising stuff happening with the Biden administration taking some of this serious. But, as far as the media, we can't trust them. But it's a little unnerving to me, the lack of coverage that this China-India story got, because it is a big deal, in my opinion.
Right. Disturbing not only in the lack of coverage by the media, but this somnambulant sleepwalking that the Department of Defense seems to be engaged in, where 99.999% of their interests and energies are going into being prepared to win the last war, with aircraft carriers and business as usual, not without any consciousness that things may have changed. Everything might have changed because of that, and that's what the revolutions in military affairs do. They can change everything. And this one could change everything, where the traditional instruments of military power simply become as obsolete as wooden sailing ships. And it wasn't just one general, but it was the officials from the Indian Defense Ministry were demanding of the Indian Prime Minister, that the transformers and SCADAs, not only in the Indian electric grid, but also in their transportation systems, for example,
right,
these need to be replaced, because they are seen as vulnerable. They probably are designed with back doors so that you can make cyber attacks. They may be designed so they're more vulnerable to EMP attacks. Right. And by the way, if China were going to do it for real, they probably wouldn't go after India. All the military doctrines on this, and Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, have all described this new way of warfare in their doctrines. It's all patterned after the Russian approach that's put out in a classic book by General Vladimir Slipchenko called No Contact Wars. Now, everybody except the Iranians actually dedicated their book. And on the first page, they mentioned their debt to Slipchenko and his ideas. The Chinese claim they invented this, okay? It wasn't, Shen-Wei Guan's total information warfare is supposed to be they invented this concept of the no contact war, they claim, but that's not true. Shen-Wei Guan's book was published much later. But the whole idea of no contact wars is a combined arms operation in electromagnetic warfare, where you start off with cyber attacks, but you also use special forces to do selective sabotage, like shooting up transformers and control centers, using non-nuclear EMP weapons to go after the grid. And then the biggest stick is a nuclear EMP attack. And all those things, any one of those things could take down the electric grid, by the way. But the combined arms use of this is like a blitzkrieg across the electromagnetic spectrum, to overwhelm your adversary very quickly and possibly win a war, in minutes or hours, and it's all over because you've crashed the electric grid and all the other critical infrastructures, and your adversary is helpless. And in fact, the clock is ticking now toward the mass extinction of his population, because people will immediately have no water and the food supplies will run out in a matter of days. So, at that point, you have no alternative but to focus on trying to recover, if recover is at all possible.
On
And
the recovery front, so there for years, for 20 years or 17 years since the EMP Commission, we've really pushed for a hardened electric grid. And it does look like there are maybe some signs in the current administration, surprisingly, where they may be taking some of this serious, and so people may be seeing in future media stories where the Biden administration or the current administration is going to be addressing some of these EMP or grid vulnerability threats. But my history of the government responding is like the last DHS report. What was it, 13 pages? It literally said nothing about anything, and it was a promise to look at something, to future plan, and they might come back with a study, and at some future date they'll fix this thing, right? I don't have a lot of faith in the government fixing it, but if there are articles coming out in the near term where they are starting to address this and take it seriously, the first focus is going to be power generation and high voltage transformers. But if we are hit with combined armed warfare, EMP, cyber, a lot of these things at the same time, while it's critical that we harden our bulk power electric grid system, there's still going to be long-term in the weeks and months for the rural people, right? We might get some of it back up here, there. We might be able to get some semblance of electricity, but if this does happen, even if we did harden the grid, is it or is it not true where you're still looking at extended blackouts for probably a good part of the country, right? Because every transformer on every power pole has to be replaced. I mean, going up the line, right? I mean, we don't have a strategy to harden all the electronics, because the computer systems in people's homes and at factories, a lot of that stuff's going to be fried too. So there is going to be some time period there where we got to come back. So I'm not minimizing the fact we have to harden the grid and we need to do it now. But what are your thoughts on that?
well, I didn't have a lot of space to expand upon it, but I have proposed a strategy that would solve that problem. And it was described briefly in the article in the China-India Blackout War article. And one of the things the administration could do, and I hope they should do, I mean, the approach should be a multi-pronged strategy, but something that could work in the longer term to protect all the critical infrastructures is pretty painless. And basically what it would do is impose national standards so that all critical electronic equipment, whether it's in the electric grid or in any of the other critical infrastructures, transformers, SCADAs, whatever, that they would have the EMP hardness designed right into them. We know that's how the Department of Defense does it when it has a system, an aircraft, whether it's an aircraft carrier or a jet or a missile or some kind of communications equipment, and it has to operate in a nuclear EMP environment. They don't retrofit it, but it's the design. The EMP hardness is baked into the design. When you do it that way, it can be you can do it very inexpensively and very easily, and it typically, historically, only adds between 1% to 6% to manufacturing cost for the system to do that. So if we started doing that same thing for SCADAs and extra high voltage transformers, at least for the most critical ones, including automobiles, for example, you can actually, it wouldn't be that hard. It would cost a couple $100 to include EMP protection baked into the design of an automobile. So if airplanes obviously should be protected against, against EMPs that don't fall out of the sky. That it would add relatively little to do it, and it would hardly be noticeable. And I say this because we as a society have really already done this. There's a natural form of EMP called lightning. In the nuclear EMP world, it's equivalent to what's called E2 EMP. It's a mid-frequency range EMP. And we almost never talk about the EMP threat from E2 EMP because almost everything is protected against it.
Right.
Our focus tends to be on the E1 EMP, which is the electromagnetic shock wave that has the short wavelengths and all that energy, and the E3 EMP, which is similar to what you get from solar storms. But E2 EMP, we don't worry about, because years ago, we as an electronic civilization can't operate without protecting electronics from lightning, because it happens all the time. Even this personal computer that I'm talking to you on has lightning protection built into it. If the plug is a little larger, if you were to look at the plug or on your personal computer, you'll see it's a fat plug. That's because there's a little surge arrestor in there, so that when there's a lightning strike on the power line, the surge arrestor stops it from getting into your computer. And then it comes on again so that the interruption is only brief and you don't even notice it. And this is done for all kinds of things, including airplanes. And it's because we have national standards, and best design practices, so that critical electrical equipment, and a lot of equipment now that isn't critical, okay? Just a lot of everything. If you can do it inexpensively, it tends to get done, so that stuff will survive lightning strikes.
But on that subject, if there are people that don't, follow me a lot, the reason why a lot of the EMP protection, the cyber protection, the high voltage transformers, the grid protection that we really need to, and critical infrastructure, like for instance, even Trump's executive order, it addressed all, like you said, it adds 1 to 6% cost on a new transformer or on new equipment. It's not that expensive. It is more to retrofit, to go back to the stuff we already have. So they did pick the kind of low-hanging fruit in his executive order. Going forward, this is the case. Well, I sit there and I look at that like, well, what about all the stuff that's there now? At some point we have to address that too. And I think the hang up there is the electric utility industry. And for those of you listening for the first time, you need to go out and you need to follow Michael Mabee. And he's been doing a lot of research into the electric utility industries and their lobbying power. I mean, they've spent $1 billion the last 10 years just at the federal level on lobbying and political contributions. And they're kind of one of the last bastions of no regulation in this country. Their industry, the federal government, short of an act of Congress, an actual act that insists and forces them, which Dr. Pry is talking about, and that's the fight of the EMP Commission, is for the government to step into this situation, like the parent in the room, and tell the electric utility industry, you must start hardening some of these critical infrastructures. But the problem that we have now is you got EPRI, you got I just found a story of Dr. Pry and Dr. Radasky here from a few years ago on the space, or 10 years ago, from the space review of a Dr. Joseph Butt. The name's very practical there. There's so much misinformation online on this threat and minimization of it that gets mainstream coverage, and people like Dr. Pry and Dr. Radasky and Baker, and the people that are trying to give the truth, that have access to the truth and the real classified data behind this that can tell you the threat, they're not getting the platform that some of these big Dr. Pry, I mean, you've got the largest platform of anybody in this fight. But that's my concern, is that even if the government steps in here, they're not going to take it far enough and really turn the hands. And there's so much money behind this from the electric utilities at every level, on the Republican side especially, too, keeping a lot of these things getting through committee. And I know you've experienced that firsthand. You've been in front of Congress so many times. I've watched all your C-SPAN interviews, and it's just like, this is common sense. This is the Achilles heel of America. We need to do this. And I mean, the fact that it hasn't been done to this point, and it seems to me that the government keeps kicking the can down the road. They give a lot of lip service, but when it actually gets to the DHS or the DOE or the DOD, and when it gets into these committees in Congress and stuff, there's always something that pulls the plug there behind the scene, which is, again, why people need to read The Power and Light. You talk about a lot of those things that are happening behind the scenes there, and it's just very frustrating. And I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to get some big fix to fix this thing, which is why I recommend people prepare for, what could come. But anyways, I'm rambling as usual. So, well, Dr. Pry, we're not going to fix all of America's problems today. I appreciate you coming on a Saturday morning and taking your time to come in and speak with us. I hope to have you on again. If you don't know, you can follow Dr. Peter Pry. His website is his organization is emptaskforce.us. That's emptaskforce.us. As always, I have a Google a search setting where it forwards me any of the articles that he comes out. And again, he's a voice of reason. He's been on the inside, he's been on the outside, and I believe he speaks the truth. And I really appreciate it, and totally honored for you taking the time out of your day today, Dr. Pry, to come on the show here. And I hope to have you on again.
Oh, the honor is mine. I always welcome an opportunity to talk directly to the people and to your audience. So thank you for having me.
All right. Well, as always, everyone, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, let God do the rest, and we'll see you next time. Take care.